Shalom, everyone. It's Rebecca Levis, and I'm coming to you from San Diego, and we're about to study the Torah together. Now, I remember when I first heard that Torah, I thought, what is the Torah? And why should I be studying that? Well, some people said, oh, I guess Rebecca's turned Jewish. No, Rebecca hasn't turned Jewish. Rebecca did have a Jewish grandfather. However, the Torah is the 5 books of Moses. It's the first 5 books of our Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And I have to say that those 5 books are foundational for the whole rest of the Bible. So the reason we study those is because once you understand, it's like the seed form for the whole rest of the Bible. Once you understand the principles and paradigms and the patterns seen from Genesis all the way through Deuteronomy, then you take those same things and you bring them into the New Testament, the Brit Hadashah, and make a bridge. And you suddenly see all these connections that you wouldn't have seen had you not studied Torah. So if you're joining me for the first time, this is the book we use, A Year Through the Torah. And it's by John Parsons, and you can get it on Amazon for about $38, $40. And you can jump into the Torah cycle. It goes for a whole year. We started last October, and it'll go to this sometime in October, I think. But anyway, you can jump in, even though we're in the book of Numbers today. Today is a little bit longer. It's a double portion day, meaning that normally you study like 3 or 4 chapters. Today we're actually covering almost six point something. So there's a lot in there, but there's 2 main things that we're going to be looking at today. The unusual exercise of the ashes of the red heifer. And the second one is the story of the talking donkey. You know, Balaam and Balak, that story. So there's a lot to hear today and learn. And just so you know, I pull out of this things that I find are interesting, or principles that perhaps I didn't know before, or perhaps you don't know. And that's why I'm choosing to take certain things and teach on those, as well as some of the Hebrew words that are meaningful to me, because I do teach beginning Hebrew, the language, and many of the students who've taken my class love this because that helps them with their vocabulary. So if that appeals to you, then join me and maybe watch this in 2 sessions, maybe 2 35-minute sessions. I think this is going to be about 1 hour and 10 minutes today. So if it seems like I'm hurrying through, it's because there's a lot to cover. So let's put on our Hebrew glasses and look at the Torah through Hebrew eyes. So what is a chukat? A chukat is a word that means to protect a value, to engrave, or set a boundary. Now, this is what God is doing. He's giving a chukat, the red heifer, and the whole teaching about the ashes of the red heifer, is a degree given by God that at first glance, it makes no sense to us. But once you see some of the spiritual principles through spiritual eyes, suddenly you can start seeing the principle and pattern that God is setting up in this story. Now, there's 3 types of laws in Scripture that you should know about. The first one is called an adot. It means a memorial or a testimony, or it means a witness to an event. So this is called an adot. That's that kind of law. Then there's a mishpat, which means a judgment between people. In other words, like moral and civil laws, things like that. And then there's the chukat. The chukat, only God knows the real reason behind it. In other words, he's looking at this because he knows the future and he understands what the outcome of obeying this will be. And I'm going to give you some hints today about what this chukat, red heifer law, is all about, according to the rabbis and the sages of old. So let's get started. Now, the red heifer, what is that? Well, a red heifer is a female cow. And the name of it in Hebrew is the parah adumah. Edom is red in Hebrew, and adumah is the color of red, like the earth, red clay. Now, this red heifer was to be without blemish and completely red. It couldn't even have one black hair. And it says it had never worn a yoke. In other words, that's free from any influence of man. So right there is our first spiritual principle, without the influence of any man, and it was of the earth. In other words, identifying with the red of the Adumah. Okay, so it was free from the influence of man, and it does what it is naturally designated to do. Okay, that's another principle. God ordained this animal to act and be a certain way. And because it had never worn a yoke, it was not influenced by humans. It would do what God created it to do. So this is another hint spiritually that of the earth, we have to depend on what God tells us we're to be and do. So that's the second principle. So in this story, Eleazar, which is the son of Aaron, remember he's the high priest, he makes these sacrifices in the Holy of Holies. Well, this one's different. This one's to be taken outside of the city of Jerusalem. He was to take this red heifer outside the camp and burn it completely. The skin, the organs, the bones, and the dung on a pyre of fire. Any outsider that viewed this could watch this dramatic death. Eleazar was to throw then into this fire cedar wood. Remember, cedar's a picture of strength. Hyssop is a symbol in the Bible of humility. And scarlet yarn is a symbol of hope, that red scarlet thread. It's the thread that goes through the whole Bible, by the way. So those three things, strength, humility, and hope, all have spiritual principles that one day we will see when the Messiah comes. Okay, so that's giving the people a picture of what we'll see and what we have seen played out in the new covenant. So that's the first principle, and the second and third. All right, so it was to be in the midst of the fire. And so this is like a picture of Jesus, Yeshua, coming in the midst, our midst on earth, and being a sacrifice. So then he was to take the ashes from this sacrifice, burned sacrifice, and put it in living water. In Hebrew, that word is chayim mayim, and it was to atone for their sin. And remember, the golden calf, well, that was the beginning of their rebellion against Moses. Remember that? I just see a typo here. So it was the first time they rebelled. So this is a continuation of more sacrifices that God is having them do for sin. So anyone who was in contact with anything that was dead or unclean or defiled was then to be sprinkled with this water and the ashes of the red heifer. Now, looking a little bit closer of the word parah for the heifer, it's parah. Anything with a P and an R in Hebrew is something to do with like fruitfulness or progenitor, and that's why this female would be the one that could produce another cow. So it's a producer of new life. So there's another spiritual principle. It was a female producer that could produce new life. What kind of life? Spiritual life. So the person would be sprinkled with the ashes of this sacrifice along with the living water, and their contact with death would be cleansed. See, this is all a picture of what Yeshua did on that tree in the New Testament. He was the sacrifice, and his death, he died in our place, was the sacrifice that would free us from sin and death and cleanse us from our guilt and of our sin. So this is the red heifer being played out here. Interesting, they would take it across the Kidron Valley. Here was the city of Jerusalem, Yerushalayim in Hebrew, and there was once a long bridge from there to the Kidron Valley, across the Kidron Valley to where? The Garden of Gethsemane. Now, the parrot was burnt there on the east side, facing the altar of the temple. They were facing, all altars face east, if you didn't know that. Every Jewish synagogue throughout the world, the altar always faces east, because that's where God is coming from. And that's where he will come from when he comes to bring final judgment. So anytime you see something facing east, it has to do with God and a judgment or atonement. So they're in now the Garden of Gethsemane. This is where this would take place. This red heifer, the progenitor of new life. So Eleazar took some of the blood of the red heifer and then sprinkled it 7 times toward the altar in the tabernacle or temple. And this was played out all through history. So this is what we're seeing here in this story. Now, the mixture of the water and ashes was called the waters of separation, or Mei Nida. Here it is, Mei Nida. Remember when we had the other story in the past of the woman who was considered unfaithful to her husband? She would drink the waters of Nida, meaning that she would drink again ashes and water for guilt, because this distanced her because of her sin. Well, here again, the distance of all sin keeps us from our relationship with God. And so God is making a way for the people to be cleansed from this distance. So the word separation or distance is nida, okay? And it's the same word, by the way, for that menstrual cloth of the woman who was going through her menstrual period, and she would be considered unclean. So this cloth was called the nida, and that symbolizes in the spiritual realm our good works that are associated with death and distance. So our religious good works cannot cleanse us inside. We can only be going through religious things, but the real cleansing comes when sin, that sin nature, is cleansed in us. So when there is death, this menstrual death, we talked about it last week, it meant that the uterus was in no shape to bring forth new life. So that's the spiritual principle. We're in no shape to bring forth the life that God demands when we're in our fallen, unclean state, and we are distant from him. Remember, Isaiah says, your sins have separated you from your God. He has turned his face and will not hear, because he can't have a relationship with anything that has relationship to death, except when he gave his own life, his own death, which reversed the curse and gave us back life. Do you see this principle? So the water of separation. But in connection with these ashes of the red heifer, death and distance was atoned for, and the defiled one was given new life. This was done on the 3rd and the 7th day. And you're thinking, why that? That is weird. Why the 3rd and the 7th day? Well, let's look at that a little closer. From Moses to the destruction of the second temple, did you know there were 9 red heifers that they found that were perfect? And the rabbis believe that the 10th one, they haven't found any since the Messiah was gave his life on the tree. They haven't found that 10th one yet. And they believe that when the Messiah returns, that they'll find a red heifer to sacrifice. And what they don't know is that the Messiah was a picture of that red heifer all along. Okay, so the Mashiach, the Messiah, conquered death when? On the third day. So isn't it interesting? They said, do it on the third day. And then it said he would banish all distance. And that is a picture of the seventh feast day when God would come and tabernacle with us. So it's pointing to what the Messiah did by rising from the dead on the third day, and then the seventh meaning the day of rest, or when ultimately we will rest from all works because of what he accomplished on the tree. So that is the beautiful picture. Now I wanted to show you, this is a picture I took when I was in Israel. And so here it is. This is the Kidron Valley here. And this is the Garden of Gethsemane, where they would take that red heifer outside the city. What's interesting is the Jewish graveyard there. I can see that spelled wrong. I'm going to correct that. Okay, so anyway, what's interesting is all these graves. The Jews believe that it's important to be buried there. So when the Messiah comes, they'll rise from the dead right there by the city. And what is so beautiful is to go there and see all these tombs, and this Absalom's tomb here, David's son. So anyway, I just wanted to give you a picture of that outside the city. Now, I wanted to show you something else that was interesting about this Garden of Gethsemane. They're taking the bull out to that place. Now, isn't that the same place where Jesus went the night before he was going to be taken in by the guards? It said he went there to pray, and it says he cried tears of blood. Now, that is a Hebrew idiom, by the way, because they call tears the blood of the eye, because it's what we're feeling inside, like the blood. The water is the blood is our life. So when we're crying, it's the emotions expressing what's going on inside, and they call that the blood of the eye. So look at what that word is for blood. It's dam. Now look, the word for Adam is Adam, and it's the same root. They just put an aleph in front. So it's the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet, meaning strength. So it's the strength of the blood, or the first blood. And that's where we get Adam's name. He was the first one, right? The first man. And because of his fall, all men now have sinned and are in the sinful state. So that's why the Messiah is called the second Adam, because he reversed the curse from Adam. And then he came from heaven to earth to take on the flesh of a man. So in other words, he came to do what Adam couldn't do. So earth is Adamah, and we see that again, the root here, the Dalet Mem. And then Adumah is where they get the red heifer. Adumah is just the name, it's a grammar, different type of grammar, but Adom means red. Okay, para is female for fruitfulness. Okay, and then she's never worn an oak or a yoke, and that's the word ol in Hebrew. In other words, they call this a virgin because she's never been affected by a man. You see that? So what was the problem? Death and distance, right? What was the provision? Well, sprinkled with the blood and the waters of separation. And notice we saw cedar, hyssop, and scarlet yarn. Well, we saw that in the past too, didn't we? Remember back in Leviticus when the leper was cleansed with the water, the living water, and the blood of the bird. Remember all that? We saw hyssop and scarlet and cedar also in that cleansing. So it shows up again here in this story of the red heifer. And then what would be the proof? Well, they would be considered clean and acceptable and relationship restored. And there you go, the promise of the restored relationship. And that's our form of worship, is to draw near, because now we're pure, we're considered clean. And so this is such a beautiful picture when you break it down. Now, the whole community came to the desert of Zin, and it says, and there Miriam died right after this story. And it says she died in a city called Kadesh Barnea. Now, this whole community, that's another word, Edah, meaning to dwell in unity. And remember, I said that an edut would be a witness or a law where you witness a principle. Well, here it is, the word community. So the whole group of witnesses came to dwell in the desert of Zin. And now this is where Aaron and Moses' sister Miriam died. And the Talmud says that Miriam died in the night and was buried by her brother Moses. But he couldn't properly mourn those 30 days because of Israel's urgent lack of water. And God told Moses to go and speak to the rock, and it will give them drink. This may have affected, they say, his anger at that point when he struck the rock twice, saying, "You rebels, must we bring water from this rock?" And there's a question there. Who's he talking about? Moses and God, or he and his sister are both upset because they couldn't mourn the death at that point. So that's questionable. So, oh no, did Moses really do that and say that? Oh boy, here we go again. So the sages say that the rock that followed Moses in the desert would actually spring up when Miriam would sing. And that is how it came to be known as Miriam's well. Isn't that interesting? The rock that provided water for Israel stopped producing, however, after Miriam's death. So all the people were saying, well, where's the water? Miriam's gone. Where's the water? So the community, kahal is another word, grumbled against Moshe. We have no water. And what happened? They start saying, we wish we had died with our brothers in the desert. Remember good old Korach that we just covered in the last session? Okay, so the whole community is grumbling. And I'm like, oh boy, they haven't learned their lesson yet, have they? And Moses said, must we bring this water forward? The we word caused Moshe to go wayward. That's what I always joke about. So be careful when you say, when you're doing something in God's name and you get all puffed up as if, you know, I'm going to teach you a spiritual lesson. Watch this. Be humble. Be humble before God. And sometimes in our anger, in our emotion, we can get puffed up and take things into our own hands. So Moses would not go into the promised land because of his anger and pride. So these are two things that we see people that God did use, yes, and did love, yes, and did want to bring to the promised land, but never made it because of pride or anger, right? Or taking things into their own hands. Only God should get the glory for any miracles that are done in our life. So I wanted to show you the kind of water that came from the rock for these millions of people. Think about Niagara Falls. I don't know if you've ever been there, but you can go on and watch the falls on YouTube. And it said that Niagara Falls can produce enough water in 17 seconds to sustain 2.5 million people with 40 gallons each per person in just 17 seconds. That's how much water is gushing over these Niagara Falls. And they said this is what it would have had to look like coming from this great rock. So I just wanted to put it in perspective real quick. So in Judaism, you would be made righteous. I wanted you to understand this by standing, and I need to bring that down, in the merit of someone else. This was a known belief in the Old Testament, that you stand in those that come before you and their righteousness and their truth and what they're teaching. It's called zechut in Hebrew. And you stand in the faith and righteousness of those who passed it on to you. And that's the whole point. So Moses is standing in the righteousness, zechut, of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and what the promise was to bring them into the promised land, that he would multiply them and bless them. And this is what Moses taught when he brought forth the law. And he says, I'm putting before you the law of God. Choose life or death. Choose blessing or curses. So this is a picture of God wanting his people to always choose life, always choose blessing, not the other. And he was bringing them into a pagan world where that would be all around them. So the principles in this story apply to all of us today. Now, Moses was pointing back to those three people that he would stand in their merit. All three sat down, by the way, of wells, water. You see, this is spiritual principles being played out here. This water symbolizes living water, new spiritual life. And this is what Jesus said. He said, you know, I have water for you that if you drink my water, you'll never thirst again. He's speaking about spiritual principles. So God used another three people in this story, Miriam, Aaron, and Moses, to bring forth this same principle. Another three people. They would bring Israel out of Egypt, and then these three were to pass on this spiritual life, which started with our father Abraham. So can you see that? So God used three leaders, all children of Amram, the Levites, to manifest three miracles. All three were to sustain Israel: the miracle of the water, the cloud, and the manna. But isn't it interesting that the water stopped when Miriam died? The cloud never showed up again when Aaron died. And the manna stopped when Moses died. They were in the promised land. So these three people brought those three miracles to sustain them, just like the Father, Son, and Spirit sustains us. Now, as the oldest, Miriam prophesied about a child, remember, who would deliver God's people from Egypt, and placed Moses in the water and saved his life. So these are all beautiful pictures of Jesus, the living water. So with Miriam's death, I already told you the water stopped. So whose righteousness now would they stand in when Miriam's gone? Israel would now have to stand in what? Aaron and Moses. And it was like God was taking away what they were to stand in one by one before he got them into that promised land. So when Aaron died, the cloud disappeared, and now there was only Moses left, who was more righteous in God's eyes, to stand before God, and he would be the last one. And when Moses died, their sustenance, that bread, stopped. And the Israelites were totally then dependent on God for all three of those things. And isn't that what we depend on today? God's truth brought about through Jesus, the gospel, the good news. And now we live in the spirit and truth. That's how we're to live. And we walk it out in our surroundings today, the pagan surroundings that we're in today, by the way. So from Kadesh, the Edomites would not let them. Now they're in the desert of Zin, and they want to go to the promised land. And they're on the king's highway. This is a trade route. And they got to the Edomite territory. And these are cousins of Esau, by the way. These were cousins, Esau. These were their people. And when they came to Mount Hor, Aaron died, and his garments were placed then on his son Eleazar. His name means helper, and the people mourned for 30 days. So they're in this place now, mourning the death of Aaron for 30 days. And they had to take this long detour around Edom for the Moabites. Okay. So the people immediately began to complain. There's no food, there's no water, and we're sick of this bread. Oh boy. We're sick of this miserable bread. It's the word kalal. Kalal means to curse something. So they were supposed to be a blessing And all these things that God did for them were to be seen as blessings, but now they're calling that a curse. Oh my goodness. So God at that moment released poisonous snakes. Now think about this. They've been in this desert for a long time, and it never talked about the people being bitten by snakes. God was holding back in his mercy and love for them these poisonous things, scorpions, snakes, vipers. Suddenly they're everywhere, and the people knew that they had sinned. Okay, they released these snakes, and many died. And God told Moses, take a bronze snake and lift it up and put it on a wooden pole. All who were bitten could then look to it and live. You're like, what? That's weird. Why would he put up a snake on a pole? Well, the word for snake, by the way, is nachash. And the gematria, or the number of those letters, adds up to 385. And guess what? The Messiah's name, Mashiach, also adds up to the same number. So it's like putting this thing that had bit them, sin, on a tree, on a wooden tree. And then he would reverse the curse from the Nachash, the Mashiach. Do you see that? It's just beautiful. The rabbis agree that that copper snake that was lifted up and those that looked to it were healed represents the Messiah. They just don't think he's come yet. So Nakash means copper or of the earth, to remind them of that initial bite way back in the garden, that venom of sin, if you will, that shows that paradigm in the Garden of Eden. Now in 2 Kings 18, the Israelites actually burnt incense to a copper snake called Nakashtan. And King Hezekiah of Judah tore it down along with their Asherah poles and their pagan altars. So see, even this snake became the symbol of worship. Oh my goodness. It's like, oh, remember the snake? Hey, let's bow down and worship it. Oh my goodness. They were doing what the pagan nations were doing, bowing down to things that man would look at and see lifted up and misrepresent it and then worship it. So this principle is no different today. People worshiping power, money, position, lifting it up, and in pride and in their anger and arrogance, then telling everybody else what to do, what to think, what to believe, what to say. And this is the fall that continues through all generations over and over and over. Now, the bronze snake represented the power to heal and restore. And that's what this was. Just as Satan used words to deceive the first Adam and Hava, Eve, it brought death and sin and distance. God separated them from the garden. Yeshua, the word, brought redemption from death and distance by becoming a living sacrifice. So after his resurrection, he gave them new life through the gift of the Spirit. So the bread and water both came from heaven, just as the Messiah and the Spirit were sent from heaven. All four were gifts to sustain man's life: the bread, the water, the cloud, the Messiah. All four given from heaven to sustain us from distance and heal us and bring us close. Now, Yeshua began his ministry in the same way. He was a blessing at first, just like the bread and the cloud and the water. But soon, those that hated him and were jealous and had no spiritual insight, they were the religious, you know, the ones that loved the praise of men and people rather than the Torah, what God said. Well, they began to resent him and hate him. And he became the problem. So they needed to get rid of him and kill him. And we're seeing that today. Those that lift up truth and those that are loyal to what God says about what is right and wrong, what is holy and unholy, what is moral and immoral, you're going to be hated just like Jesus. And he said, if they hated me, they're going to hate you. So at first, what was a blessing then became the cursed people, the cursed one. And that's what we see. It says, cursed is everyone who's hung on a tree. And that's what Jesus did. Remember, I said the word for curse was kalal. We hate this bread. Okay. They hated Jesus. It also means to diminish. So this is what the rabbis wanted to do, to diminish Jesus as the Messiah. And today we're seeing the same thing, where we're disenfranchised. You know, we're the ones that are the problem. We're the ones. It's conspiracy theory. It's all just their theory, and they try to put Christians down as if we're some kind of, meek, mild, milquetoast, brainwashed, extreme right people. But when we stand on God's truth, we're going to be hated. And just realize that. We may even be killed for our faith and thrown in prison for our faith, and our Bibles taken away for our faith. And will you be willing to stand then? That's a question our pastor asked us last week. So look at Galatians 3:13. He who knew no sin became sin for us, the symbol of sin, that we might become the righteousness of God. That's what Galatians 3:13 says, the curse being reversed. Oh my goodness. So now let's look at this next portion of scripture, the story of Balak and Balaam, or Balaam. And his name means to destroy. It's interesting because what this story is about is Balak wanting to destroy Israel when they came into their land. He knew the story of the Exodus and what God was doing in his miracles for this group of people. And he was afraid of them. And because he was afraid of his kingdom being affected by these religious people from God, he wanted to destroy them. He wanted them dead. Isn't it interesting that these two stories are going together today? And God is showing his faithfulness even in the midst of pushback. So this is another story very similar. So who was Balak? Now, when the Moabites heard that the Israelites had done this, had conquered these two Amorite kings, they sought allies with the Midianites. So it would be the Moabites and the Midianites that they were going to go and look for more fighting men so they could stand up against the Israelites. Perhaps hoping that support would come because Moses had married a Midianite and came from that same family. So maybe they were thinking, well, let's go down there and see if they're open, and we'll pretend like we want to bless them, but we really want to curse them. So anyway, there's all kinds of what do they call it? Backroom deals going on here. So they're going to do spiritual warfare. They're going to go and inquire of this seer named Balaam to come and bless the people. But really, Balak wanted them cursed. So let's review. When Abraham rescued Lot from Sodom and Gomorrah, remember Lot hid in a cave with his two daughters, and they got him drunk and had sex with Lot, and they became the Moabites and the Amorites. Now, this two group of people are the ones giving Israel the problem. And so you can see when people take things into their own hands, this is the fallout generations later. And this is the same today. When we take things into our own hands in the spiritual realm and we compromise or we cave to the world system around us, there's going to be fallout, and it's not going to be good. And it may not show up right away, but it will show up. So these are the stories that you have to pay attention to. Now, the Moabites had installed a new king, Zur of Midian, whose name was changed to Balak. So he was a Moabite, and he now a Moabite, but he was from Midian. Okay, so he came now to this area. He changed his name to Balak, and he was a magician trained in the occult. So here it is. Here, I put stars by them. This is King Balak here, now in the land of Moab, but he was from here originally. So he's going to go back to his people and get some help. So this is the land of the Amorites. And here is Ammon. This is an Armenian tribe here. And up here is the Syrian tribe, the kingdom of Bashan. This was the two kings that Israel fought against and won, King Og and King Sihon. So these were people that had heard of these battles. And now here's Israel camped right here, mourning for the death of Aaron. And they're between a rock and a hard place, if you will, these two groups of people. They need God to step in at this point. Isn't it funny that Zur means confined or besieged? And this is the desert of Zur that they're in right here. And Balak means to destroy. So the story is pretty dramatic. Israel had just defeated those kings now and was camped there. Balak feared them and appealed to the Midianites, their natural enemies, as allies. Now, this is happening today all over the world, right? The people that were once, our enemies, they see that, oh, now we're weaker and they're stronger. So now let's go and pretend that we want to be allies. And this has been going on throughout history. This whole thing with the Russians and the Ukrainians and the Iranians and the Turks and this is all history, people. Human nature has not changed. History just keeps repeating itself in different generations with different names. So that's where we are here. So who's in charge? Will it be Balak with his agenda, or will it be Bilam, who God uses to fulfill his agenda? So let's look at these words in Hebrew. It's interesting that there are words that have common letters and they'll have common nuances of meaning. And I want to just show you this real quick because both of these people have BL in there. This is a bet and a lamed, a bet and a lamed. And BL combinations are never good, just so you know, in history and in the Hebrew language. Look at these words with BL, 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 BL. This one, Habal, means vanity, no value. Okay, that's where we get the word vanity, vanity, hevel, hevel in Hebrew. That's this word, and it comes from the verb Habal. Okay, that's vanity. And that's what we do in vain when we try to act religious. It's our own religious activity, which is as filthy rags. Remember that. So then this word, Bala, Bala means chaos or decay. Bala, just with a different ending letter, means to wear out. And then Bila with a different letter, there's three letters that sound like A in Hebrew. So Bila, 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 Bila. Oh, that's funny. Never thought of that until just now. Okay. It means to devour, calamity, or to swallow or consume somebody or get rid of them. Okay. All these words are related to Balaam and Balak because both of them are not godly people. And this is not good in the flesh. But God is going to step in and do something in the spiritual realm in this story that's unbelievable. Here's a few more. Look at this one. Balal means to confuse. Babylon, Babel, okay, confuse. Mabul is a flood or to mix things up and cause confusion. And then Abel means to mourn or destroy. And this was the name of the one that Cain destroyed, his brother Abel. It meant that in his eyes, in Cain's eyes, he wanted to destroy that brother because he was right before God. It's almost like here's the very seed form of the first murder. Cain hated the one that was right, and so he killed him. It's the same principle as we're seeing in the garden, same principle that we're seeing here and in the story of Cain and Abel. We got to get rid of those that are standing up and doing what is just and right. Let's kill them. Let's get rid of them. And if you've not been to the Holocaust Museum in Israel, it's shocking, the evil that was in the world at that time. And it's there today, the same thing. So, what do all these words have in common? All of them have to do with something that is out of order and has negative outcomes, period. Out of order and negative outcomes. And we're going to see that Babylon spirit going on in our world today. So Balaam knew about the God of Israel, and the sages suggest that God temporarily used him to actually speak on God's behalf. Balak believed that Moses' strength was in his mouth. Whatever Moses said, God would do through Moses. And it's interesting that Moses first complained to God. Remember that? He said, "Oh, I'm weak of tongue. I can't speak to those people to go save them from Egypt." Well, now look at how that's turned around. Once God gets a hold of Moses' tongue, now Balak's afraid of Moses' tongue. Isn't that funny? So because of this, Balak sent these elders from Moab and Midian to Balaam, this seer, to ask him to come and curse Israel with his mouth. Oh boy, that's not a good idea. Balak's plan was to fight in unconventional spiritual warfare with curses or witchcraft. Okay, so the first time Balak sent messengers, Balaam said, "No, I'm not going to go." He said, "Because I can only do what Adonai says," and Adonai says not to curse those people because they're actually blessed by me, by God. So then this Balak sends more important people. I can twist some arms. And Balaam is then told by God, "Go with them, but only say what I tell you to say." So Balaam agrees to go, and the next morning he leaves on his donkey, which was a female donkey. Now we saw a female in that last story of the parah for cleansing, right? Well, now here's a female donkey in this story. Not a coincidence. Look at what the name of a female donkey is in Hebrew, aton. Oh my goodness. It's like this donkey is going to atone once again for the mistake of man who can't see with spiritual eyes. This female is going to atone for the mistake of the stupid guy on the donkey. Okay, so a male donkey is called a hamar. So here's Balaam now. He's on this donkey. And on the way, the female donkey sees an angel with a drawn sword standing to oppose Balaam. And when the donkey left the path, Balaam got angry and started beating her. Then she saw the angel a second time and moved aside against the wall and actually crushed his foot. And the third time, the angel of the Lord moved ahead to a place where it would be impossible for them to pass. And the donkey saw that angel for the third time, the Lord actually, and she said she sat down. And in Hebrew, it means to bow down. Now, Balaam, he can't see it because he's looking at things through human eyes. It says in the New Testament, the man without the Spirit cannot receive the things of God, nor can he understand them because they're spiritually discerned. That's in the book of Romans. Now, Balaam becomes angry because he doesn't get it. So he uses his pride and his anger because he's looking like a fool. Okay, so he beats her with a stick. Where have we seen somebody be beaten and misunderstood? So then the Lord opens the mouth of the donkey to speak on his behalf. To oppose them, this is where this angel was standing. Look, it's the word Satan, and it's spelled with Samech Tet Nun. Well, the name for Satan is Sin Tet Nun. Satan, but just different first letters. Because remember I said if they share two of the same letters, and here we see the Tet and the Nun, they're going to be related. Well, to oppose us is what Satan does. And every time somebody wants to oppose the things of God, you're going to find anger, and separation and distance and people being misunderstood and mixed up and confused. This is all a part of these stories, people. So God performed a miracle and gave this donkey the ability to speak, just like he performed a miracle and gave Moses the ability to speak. And the donkey says, I'm yours, right? I have been faithful. Jesus was faithful to his people. We need to be faithful to God. Have I ever treated you like this? I'm doing these things for your benefit, yet you're too stupid to see it because you don't have spiritual eyes. This is the difference between the world, that kingdom, and the kingdom of God. There's only two kingdoms, people. There's the kingdom of darkness, and Satan is the ruler of that and his demonic forces. And there's God's kingdom, the people that believe God's words. Okay, so he doesn't get it. And suddenly it says, Adonai opens his eyes and Balaam sees the angel with the drawn sword. And it says he bowed down as an act of submission. And we don't know, was he scared to death bowing down, or was it a spiritual submission? And what the Bible says in Philippians 2:10 is someday every knee will bow. Everybody in our culture, everybody who mocks the name of Jesus, every religion that stands against the gospel of grace and the death, resurrection, and ascension of Jesus Christ, everyone who opposes that message will bow their knee one day, and you will confess Jesus is who he said he was, the Lord himself. Okay, so here's where we are in the story. Finally, Balaam bows down. The angel asked him, why did you hit your donkey 3 times? See, this number 3 keeps coming up. 3 is the number of revelation or miracles. And so it was 3 times he struck the donkey, who's saving his life these 3 times. Okay, so he says, if it wasn't for her and what she was doing, you'd be dead. And I feel that way today. If we don't speak up truth to people, then their blood is going to be on us because we didn't speak truth. You know, yes, we're to embrace and love, but not tolerate evil, not tolerate immorality, not accept it and worship it and lift it up and parade it around. That is not biblical. So perhaps the appearance of the angel 3 times is also pointing back to the 3 patriarchs. And that said, I will utterly bless those who bless you, but utterly destroy those who want to kill and destroy you. So Balaam was shown God's mercy, and he finally said, I have sinned against you. He says, do you want me to go back? Do you want me to repent, return? Okay, so no, he goes forward, and what happens? 3 times, Balak takes Balaam to these high mountains to curse God's people, but all that come out of his mouth is blessing. All of the power and wealth and determination of these pagan nations could not overpower or thwart God's intense love for his people and his plans to faithfully bring Israel to this place of promise. This was his covenant to the 3 patriarchs. This ends with Balaam prophesying about a future ruler. It comes out of his mouth. It talks about a star that will rise and a scepter that will rule. Oh my goodness. This is how this story ends, this beautiful story. In Numbers 24:17, it says this, and this is coming from Balaam's lips. I see him, the Messiah, but not now. I behold him, but not soon. A star will step forth from who? Yaakov, Jacob. A scepter will arise from Israel, God's people, Jacob. Someone who will rule his enemies will be his possession. That star in King that's talked about here in Numbers 24 is referenced in Matthew 2:2 by the Magi. When they come to look for the newborn king, these are seers from the same area. They heard about this prophecy of Balaam. They know about a scepter and a star that's prophesied. A king will rise. Okay. And they go, where is this newborn king of the Jews? We have seen his star in the east and have come to worship him. Now, whenever God is about to do something high or holy, you'll always find a mocker. Just know that. Whenever God is going to do something to give truth to people, there'll be mockers, and we'll see them today too. So the men of Israel began then after this incident to worship these gods of Baal Peor. This is so sad. This is what happened right after this story. And God told Moses to go and get the chief people who were involved and hang them facing where? The east, the place of judgment, where the Messiah will ultimately come to judge the world. So he hangs them up facing the one who they will face in the end. And he says, kill them all, hang them up. Now, just as they were weeping in front of the Mishkan, the tent, the Israelite man named Zimri walks into the camp with this Midianite woman, Cosby, takes her into the tent to have sex with her right in front of all these leaders and Moses. It was that mocking spirit that says, in your face, we're just going to parade around whatever we think we want to do sexually. Oh my goodness, what happens? It says Phinehas, the son of the high priest, remember that Aaron had died, they put the clothes on Eleazar. He grabs a spear and he runs in there. Now, a spear has a point, and I love the picture of a sword or a spear because to me, it's things that start out parallel, but as we get closer to each other, we begin to find more and more truth until we're so united as one, we can penetrate the culture. That's the power of a double-edged sword. Do you see that? So he runs in to penetrate that spirit, that mocking spirit in the camp. And guess what? The plague that started as soon as he did that stopped immediately, but 24,000 had already died before Phinehas could go in and grab a spear and do that. That would be like 2,000 per 12 tribes, right? By the way, it's noteworthy that later in the scripture, in Joshua 13:2, it says that Balaam, this one who prophesied that a star and a scepter would rise, he actually died and was killed by the sword, the one that could penetrate who he truly was. Look at the word for sword in Hebrew. It's karav, and it's where we get the word korban, to draw near with worship. But it's flipped, and they switch the letters to kaver, and it means sword or grave. It's just the same letters, but they share all the same letters. They just flip them around, and the sword became the place of death. You see? So things that death and distance are going to be taken care of in the end by a sword. And this is the sword of the Spirit. That's why we worship him in spirit and in truth, because it's a double-edged sword. Do you see all these pictures here? So this is how this story ends. So Baal worship involved, by the way, temple prostitutes, in other words, illicit sex, and killing of babies. They were throwing them in the Baal gods. Here it is. This cave, and it would be all lit with fires, and they were worshiping Baal. Did you know that there was actually a traveling pagan Baal worship temple that was going around New York, London, Washington, D.C., and in Amsterdam? I'll show you a picture of it right here. It looked like this, and you can read about it here. I left this in as a slide so you can look at it yourself. And I'm looking at our culture today, and I'm going, look at Burning Man out in the desert. You wouldn't catch me there for $1 million. It's all about lifting up these images and worshiping them with partying and drinking and drugs and illicit sex and counterfeit love. This is no different than what we were seeing in the Bible, in every generation since, by the way. I want to end with this quote from Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks. He was the former chief rabbi of Great Britain. He died recently, but he made this prophetic warning back in 2011 about the new moral reality that he saw beginning in Great Britain and across the world. Here's what he said. He said, a tsunami is coming, a tsunami of wishful thinking, not truth, wishful thinking. In other words, no reality. Wishful thinking has washed across the West, saying, here it is, that you can have sex without responsibility of marriage, children without the responsibility of parenthood, social order without the responsibility of citizenship, patriotism, liberty without the responsibility of morality, and self-esteem without the responsibility of hard work and earned achievement. All you have to do is hold that up to the news stations today, and that is the wishful thinking that's been going on ever since the beginning of the world. And Rabbi Sachs just verbalized it, oh my goodness, 12 years ago, and that's now. That wishful thinking has now become our reality. So this is a good place to stop sharing and to say, this is the time for Christians to stand strong, not to be hateful and mean, but to speak truth, not to compromise, not to cave, but to speak truth in love and hopefully pull others from the fire of that pagan spirit that we see in that kingdom of darkness in our world today. So are you going to stand in these days? I pray you will, and I pray I will, as I stay close to the one who bought me, paid for the price of my sin, and now lives in me through his Spirit. May God dwell in you, and may he give you his peace, his shalom, and may you live in his truth. In Jesus' name. Amen. See you next time on Sparky's Story Time.